Did I ever tell you about the time the United States Army National Guard was equipped with nuclear missiles? It gets better. The nukes were made to shoot down aircraft. It gets better. The nukes were made by a telephone company. Do I have your interest, your curiosity, perhaps? Well then, stick around because you are watching Midnight After Dark. I am your host, Maverick Midnight, and tonight we are talking about a fascinating time in American history, about the Nike Missile Project. Some of your eyebrows just went up. Nike, no affiliation to the sports company. Blue Ribbon Sports Incorporated changes its name to Nike in 1971. The United States Army surface-to-air anti-aircraft missile defense system, Project Nike, is proposed in 1945. However, the name goes back even further. Nike comes to us from ancient Greece. Nike was the Greek goddess of victory. Both organizations, the Army and the sports people, are using the name as sort of a brand association with success. So anyway, the Nike Missile Project defended the eastern coast of the United States. There's a handful of bases in other parts of the US, but a majority of them are on the eastern coast. And that's not particularly surprising. You see, the United States built the eastern coastline in what can only be called in professional circles a target-rich environment. See, all of our major government, military, and intelligence services, agencies, and infrastructures are on the East Coast. If I walk out my front door and I throw a rock, I'm gonna hit Fort Eustis, Naval Weapons Station, the Coast Guard Station, Langley Air Force Base, the NASA Propulsion Laboratory, Jefferson Labs. Let's throw that rock a little further. Washington, D.C., the CIA headquarters. Do I need to continue? So Nike protects pretty much from like Florida up to Maryland or thereabout. What are we protecting the East Coast from? Well, atomic bombers. See, the United States was terrified that the Soviet Union would develop atomic weapons. They would put them on long-range bombers, and they would coat the East Coast from Florida to Maryland in atomic fire. So, why did we fear this? Well, because we had just done it. The Nike Missile Project was proposed in 1945, pretty much directly after the United States atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which, if you're not familiar, a conservative estimate of the casualties at Hiroshima are 80,000 people. The range is typically regarded as 80,000 to 150,000. Usually it's rounded up to 100,000 people. The world had just become blatantly aware of the dangers an aircraft approaching a city unchallenged could bring. Countermeasures would need to be developed. The only way to hit a target is to send an aircraft. So the best way to stop the bomb is to stop the aircraft. You picking up what I'm putting down? The Nike missile system was proposed as a counter to this. Now you might ask yourself, did we not have any sort of an anti-aircraft countermeasure before? So let's do a little thought experiment here. You and your buddies, you're anti-aircraft gunners, right? You're stationed around the city of London. It's the Battle of the Blitz. You have a policy of, it flies, it dies. Accuracy by volume of firepower, baby. You paint the sky with lead until it's dead. And according to historians, you have about a 10% effectiveness. See, the Battle of the Blitz gives us pretty much the best example of how anti-aircraft guns fared against aircraft. 12 aircraft were shot down by AA gunners around the city. That's an impressive number. It costs an equally impressive amount of ammunition. 4,000 rounds of ammunition are expended to shoot down 12 planes. Oh, my mistake. 4,000 rounds per aircraft. 55,000 rounds of ammunition are estimated to have been spent taking out those 12 aircraft. So it wasn't perfect, but it was effective, right? Well then, 1944, something changes. The German Messerschmitt jet-powered aircraft screeches onto the scene. And warfare is forever changed. See, jet-powered aircraft compared to propeller-powered aircraft, we have nowhere near the time to talk about how different a propeller engine is from a jet-powered engine. So let's do a little analogy here. Propeller aircraft, they're guys racing horses. Jet-powered aircraft, that's a guy in a Ferrari. That's what happens. Jet-powered aircraft, the Messerschmitt shows up, and it is twice as fast and capable of flying twice as high as its propeller-based counterparts. Now, it took y'all 4,000 rounds of ammunition to hit a slow-moving normal plane. It goes twice as fast. Is that twice as much ammunition? You're going to spend 8,000 rounds now? No. You're not going to spend anything. This aircraft can fly so high, the projectile cannot reach an elevation to even threaten a jet aircraft. Overnight, anti-air guns are rendered obsolete, at least with regards to jets. So they recognize that jets are going to become the new future aircraft. The United States Army Ground Forces, they sent a request to the War Department, an incredibly well-worded, succinct, and direct request, which read as follows: Major caliber, anti-aircraft, rocket, torpedo. That's a very evocative sentence. I would put it up there with unrestricted submarine warfare as being one of the more beautiful sentences in the English language. The United States War Department gets this request and says, yeah, that's pretty cool, and then they put it in a drawer and they forget about it. Until 1945, after the atomic bombs, they realized we need some sort of a countermeasure. And then they remembered rocket torpedo proposal and they said, hey, throw some money at that. They put out a request for companies to pitch their idea. 2 companies answer the call: Bell Laboratories and General Electric. For those that are not aware, Bell Telephone Company has a research division called Bell Laboratories, often referred to just as Bell Labs. So they pitched their idea for the Nike anti-aircraft missile defense system. What makes Nike different comparative to what we had before? I could tell you, but I'm better at showing. See, I'm not great with words. I don't really use them much myself. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I need some visual. That'll work. Here's what made Nike so different and so complicated. Traditional ways of shooting down an airplane would go a little something like this. Your airplane flies in. This is the airplane, if you hadn't guessed. Your airplane flies in, a missile launches after it. This relies on the missile being fast enough to catch up and hit the aircraft. It's called the chase method. It kind of becomes not really feasible when we have supersonic aircraft that can outrun most things. So Nike operates on something called the lead and intercept method. It looks a little something like this. Your aircraft comes flying in. There's 3 radar systems associated with Nike: search and acquisition, tracking, and missile tracking. It works like this. Search and acquisition sees the plane coming in and says, that's a plane. Search and acquisition hands that information to target tracking. Target tracking now follows this. All of this information is being fed back to a computer. So the computer, in real time, 1945, is interpreting the data the radar is sending it and saying, based on what I know about aviation, that aircraft is going to fly this way. I don't think it's going to go up here. I don't think it's going to go down here. I think it's most likely it's going to do this. Therefore, I'm going to launch this missile right here. And this is what's going to happen. Lead and intercept. It is much more complicated, and it relies on being able to adapt things in real time. This meant the missile had to be guided, so the 3rd radar would track the missile. It's a pretty impressive system. They test it out, and whoo boy, it can shoot down an airplane. Not a problem. The original request that the United States Army put out was for a missile that could hit 500 miles an hour and engage targets at 60,000 feet. It's a pretty tall order. A tall order to which Bell Labs laughed and said, I'll do you one better. Here's a missile that goes 1,000 miles an hour and can smack the hell out of something at 75,000 feet. What do you want us to do next? The Army was very pleased with it, and they moved to start installing Nike, except they ran into a problem. So Nike has a 25-mile range. That's not, there's certain cities you can drive for 25 miles and you're still in the city. That means these have to be very much inside the city and close to the coastline. Nike required 120 acres per site. If there is one unifying factor among large metropolitan cities such as New York, Washington, D.C., Chicago, there ain't a whole lot of 120 acres just empty land sitting around. So what do we do? Well, the good folks at Bell Labs said, the only reason we need 120 acres is as a safety measure. The missiles were basically standing up in an open field, and if one of them blew up, we got to have room for it to safely blow up because it's in the middle of a city. One of their big brain boys said, hey, what if we dig a hole and fill it with concrete and just stuff the missiles down there? So they do that. An underground bunker, which they refer to as a magazine that they keep the missiles in. This bunker is very safe, it's very concrete, and it's very sturdy. That was a terrible sentence. Now, with this new safety innovation, the Nike site can be cut from 120 acres to 40 acres. So the Army says, let's go. Full send, baby. May 30th, 1953, the first Nike site reaches operational status combat ready in Fort Meade, Maryland. Over the next few months, other sites would be installed. The Nike system begins with 240 bases across the US. Like I said, most of them are on the East Coast. There's some other ones in some other places, but we're talking about the East Coast. As Nike is being deployed, as Bell is patting themselves on the back for fully satisfying all the conditions of this Army contract, the Army says, hey, the radar system could not identify individual targets when faced with a formation. Why is that a problem? Well, Soviet battle doctrine for air assaults at the time was to just keep sending aircraft. The first wave would essentially be a suicide run. Their whole intent would be to take out anti-aircraft defenses so the second wave could approach their targets unchallenged. Because we're talking about the end of the world at this point. If they're sending wave after wave of aircraft against the American shores, it's all bets are off, baby. The Cold War just went hot. The human race is pretty much at an end. So, if that happens, we want to be able to do the maximum amount of defensive damage that we can against these aircraft. Since Nike does not recognize individual aircraft, it would view a formation of bombers with fighter escort as one large radar blip. This means Nike could approach that radar blip, explode inside the radar blip, and be completely ineffective. It could blow up in the air between planes because it's not targeting an individual plane. But this was never addressed during the developmental process. Nike was only tested against single targets. This idea of countering a fleet of aircraft was not mentioned. So this issue was not an issue. It was a afterthought that became a little bit of a huge concern. The United States Army asked Bell to try to fix this. This is where we get a change to the Nike naming convention. All Nike stuff prior to this point is retroactively named Nike Ajax. Nike being the name of the system, Ajax being the missile. Again, we're dealing with mythology. Ajax was the soldier who was stronger than all of Greece. Also, that's a fun pun if you ever look at Ajax dish detergent. Anyway, getting back to it. So Nike Ajax, it is named so because 1956, Nike Hercules begins development. Now, what makes Hercules so different? The big brain boys at Bell said, we could fix this radar issue. It's not going to be fun. We're going to have to develop a whole new radar that can do all kinds of stuff. Or we can say, it's not a bug, it's a feature. It sees it as one big target. It's one big target, baby. We just need one big boom. So they strapped a Whiskey 31 nuclear device to the end of it, and they made a nuclear anti-aircraft missile. Here's the thing. The atomic weapon that leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those weapons were 15 kiloton yield. The Whiskey 31 warhead on the end of a Nike missile was a 20 kiloton yield. It is stronger than the device that killed 80,000 people on a conservative estimate. I don't think it's going to have an issue with a couple of airplanes. So they said, all right. However, not sure how familiar you are with nuclear weapons. One of the key things with them is that they tend to be a lift with your legs, not your back kind of situation. It's now too heavy to fly. So again, they said, we could do all this stuff and build a new rocket engine, we could come up with a new type of fuel, we could do some other research, or I'm trying to go home, it's the weekend, I got stuff to do. Strap 4 of the current rocket boosters together and just put that on the end of it and call it a day. So that's what they do. The new Nike Hercules missile operates with a Whiskey 31 nuclear warhead and has a quad rocket booster based on the original single rocket booster. They literally just put 4 of them together and called it a day. Now this isn't going to do that much of a difference, right? Oh, wrong. The original request by the Army is for a missile that can hit 500 miles an hour and engage targets at 60,000 feet. Nike Hercules is now able to reach 3,000 miles an hour, engage targets at 150,000 feet, and Nike Ajax had an effective range of about 25 to 30 miles. Nike Hercules laughs at that and hits targets 75 miles away. It is an incredibly effective system, so effective that they don't really see a point in keeping Ajax around. So in 1958, Nike Hercules begins deployment, Nike Ajax begins shutting down. If they could not convert a base to operate Hercules, they just shut the base down. Hercules is a little bit heavier, the missiles are a little bigger, so those 240 Nike sites are reduced to 135. However, each missile is literally triple the effectiveness of Ajax, so yeah, they lost some sites, but the new missiles are so good it doesn't make that much of a difference. The United States Army calls the Nike Hercules system rings of supersonic steel surrounding key cities. And if you look at a map, that's how they're arranged. They are basically circles around the city to provide maximum coverage. So this should be a win and should be it for the system, right? Well, intercontinental ballistic missile development has started to become a thing. And there's been this notion of, why do we need to build bombers that have to be piloted by a person? If we use ICBM, we don't even have to leave the house. We launch it from Russia, it goes up, it comes back down, it hits Washington. Why would we bother with bomber planes when we can make an ICBM? If you're not familiar, the current recognized criteria for an ICBM is that it can hit a minimum of 5,000 miles away. That's the minimum. There are many that can go quite a distance further than that. We now have ICBMs equipped on submarines that can be anywhere in the world waiting at the bottom of the ocean that surface and just attack. So ICBMs, they're a little bit of a problem. So the United States Army, again, approaches Bell. Is there a way that Nike could be adapted as a counter ICBM measure? Now bear in mind, the United States Army's own engineers said that this was essentially like trying to shoot a sniper's bullet with another sniper's bullet. They did not believe this was physically possible. And Bell Labs said, yeah, I think we could do that. So they started on Nike Zeus, the counter ICBM phase of Nike. Now, surprisingly, they really didn't have to change much about the missile. They finally had to address the issues with the target because you're no longer dealing with a fleet of aircraft, you're back to dealing with a singular target. Granted, it's a very fast-moving target, but it is a singular target, the lone ICBM. So, most of the development went into making the radar better, and they made some solid progress. However, it's not a cheap thing to counter one of the most advanced weapon systems in the world, so Nike Zeus is shut down for being a little too costly. This happens in 1963. However, as soon as it shuts down, they start a new project called Nike X. X typically designates experimental. I know the X-Files are going to make you think that X designates conspiracies and spooky stuff like that. Typically with military stuff, if it has X in the designation, that means it's a prototype or an experiment. So Nike X it's kind of like a think tank, right? They got like 75% of the guys that work on Nike Zeus are brought over to Nike X. And they're told, hey, we like the stuff you were doing, keep doing it, but you are no longer needed to be beholden to the Nike system. Just keep developing stuff and see what y'all can come up with. Nike X spawns two separate missile programs, the Spartan missile and the Sprint missile that belongs to the Safeguard program. The Stanley R. Michelson Safeguard complex will be the subject of another video, so just bear that in mind. Even when they decided not to develop Zeus, they still turned Zeus into two other missile programs. It's incredible just how good this system is. Here's something we got to talk about. The space race of the 1960s was seen as this great time that America and the Soviet Union could put aside their differences, reaching to the stars instead of atomic fire. Except most of the space race was a cover for weapons development. So the first man-made object in space is called Sputnik. It's launched by the Soviet Union. Did you ever wonder how Sputnik got up there? So it takes a considerably powerful rocket to get something into space, right? So Sputnik is carried by an R-7 launch vehicle. What is an R-7 launch vehicle, you might ask? It's an intercontinental ballistic missile that just has a spot for the satellite instead of an explosive warhead. Most of the rockets that are carrying stuff to space are ICBMs that have been modified. This is when we see the lovely trend of MIRV. Now, I don't remember the exact acronym here. It's something like multiple independent remote re-entry vehicles or something like that. Here's what it means. ICBM, enormous missile that can go a ridiculous distance. Well, because there's so much missile, you can carry a little bit more. So the idea behind a MIRV is you have multiple nuclear missiles, you stuff them inside the nose cone of the big rocket, and when the big rocket burns up all its fuel and it gets to the target, its nose splits open. 5, 6, 7, 10 independent nuclear missiles that they all have their own individual targets. They split off and they go and they cause widespread destruction against whatever target they've been selected. This way you could use one device to just level multiple zip codes. It's a pretty terrifying weapon system. This leads to 1972. SALT, S-A-L-T, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. This is where the United States and the Soviet Union finally sit down and they say, hey man, if you keep building better countermeasures, I'm just going to keep building more missiles. At a certain point, you're going to run out of countermeasures and I'm still going to have missiles and then I'm going to level your city. So, the idea that development of anti-ICBM countermeasures would actually lead to more ICBMs is Kind of screwy, but it works. This results in the ABM Treaty, Anti-Ballistic Missile. The idea is that both countries, US and Soviet Union, would limit their counter ICBM facilities to one facility per country. Not one type of facility, one facility that could counter an ICBM. The US agrees. They say, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. Remember how I said Nike was already pretty good? The Soviet Union thought so as well. They said, you think it's only good against aircraft? Nah, baby, that's an ICBM countermeasure if I've ever seen one. That falls under this principle. In 1974, all Nike bases have been shut down because they were regarded as anti-ballistic missile countermeasures. That's not what this was made to do. Bear you in mind. Nike future-proofed itself so good it got itself banned for being too effective. You don't really hear that when it comes to most things the government has paid money for. Most of the time they end up being, what's the professional word? Hot garbage. So Nike's an impressive system all around. There's a couple of bases that manage to skirt by, specifically Florida and Alaska. The Nike bases there identify as coastal air defense, and they are able to survive until 1979 when they are also shut down. And thus we have the end of the Nike system. This treaty only applies to the home countries of the US and the Soviet Union. American bases in Europe still keep the Nike system. In fact, they keep the Nike system until the late 80s. And even then, they only get rid of it because of the Patriot missile system. And Patriot was not regarded as being better. It was seen as being like 75% as effective as Nike. Patriot was kind of like an RV truck with a missile backpack, right? It was mobile, is the point that I'm getting to. Nike's a building, it ain't really mobile. So this limited effectiveness was still counterable by the fact that it could move wherever you needed it. So they opted to switch to the Patriot missile system, and a lot of the guys who were on the Nike system were pretty upset that this happened. They felt that Nike was still an effective system and it didn't deserve to be phased out like this. Our NATO allies felt the same way. The Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Spain, Turkey? I don't know. A bunch of countries use Nike, and they keep using it until 1991. And they only stop using it because the Soviet Union falls and they feel like they're no longer threatened. And it's part of what I think makes Nike so interesting. It's one of the few defensive nuclear weapons. Its original purpose is to protect a city. Now, I mentioned in the introduction, it was manned by National Guard soldiers. This was sort of a cost-saving measure, right? If they were to put regular Army guys on here, they would have to build full facilities to station guys at Nike bases. They would have to have barracks and medical facilities and cafeterias, or bigger cafeterias. Nike bases had cafeterias, but they were small. But here's the thing. Nike's already within the city's walls. There's National Guard guys that live in those cities. The base is so close they can probably bicycle to work, if we're being honest. So they staff them with National Guard, except for the higher commands of the base. The base officer was always an active duty officer, and it was common for some of the upper non-commissioned officers, your first sergeant, platoon sergeants, your senior NCOs, were typically active duty. What I found absolutely fascinating reading about the system, Nike officers, when they were assigned to a Nike base, let's just see how many times we can say Nike in a sentence. When these officers were assigned to a base, they would enter a classroom and there would be a number 5 on the board. They were told Nike had a 5-minute life expectancy. The Soviet Union's hit list looked a little something like this: the United States command and control government structure, and then Nike. It was our only anti-aircraft defense system, meaning it was the only thing that could challenge the bombers aside from other aircraft. Aside from engaging them with jet fighters, this was the only ground-based defense system they had to worry about. As a result, if the attack ever happened, remember what I said earlier, the first wave of bombers, their only intent is to hit a Nike base, to make it so the other bombers can do what they do without being hassled. So these guys lived every day knowing that if that alarm ever sounded, 5 minutes. That's it. That's all you got left on this earth. And they're not using it to say goodbye to their loved ones. They're not able to sit down and say a prayer and make peace with their creator. Nah, these boys are going out fighting. That was why Nike soldiers trained and maintained themselves to such a high standard. Everything was going to come down to approximately 5 minutes that they could get as much ordnance into the air as possible. These guys are directly protecting their city. So they're going to do the best that they can do. If they can't survive, then maybe their family can. Maybe the missile only hits the Nike base and they can drop the bombers before the bombers drop the bombs. That's how they operated. Going down, swinging. So this is what I find fascinating about the Nike system, is that it's been kind of forgotten. It had this rather unceremonious end, this sort of a tragic story, as tragic as you consider the story of a nuclear weapon, that it is taken out of commission for being too good, and then it's forgotten about. And the way that I found and learned about Nike is because there's a base right here. I was wandering in the woods, as I so often do, and I said, hey, there's roads in these woods, and they're paved roads, and there's fire hydrants. Something's back here. And eventually, I found the towers in the woods that I had heard others talk about. Many people have told me about the towers in the woods. Nobody that I have met knew the actual identity of the towers. I've heard things from they were radio towers. I've heard that they were the original air traffic control towers before the airport was expanded. I've heard all kinds of things. None of them are correct. Those ramshackle, falling apart, surreal towers in the woods, they look like something out of a science fiction movie, a post-apocalyptic movie in the condition that they are now. Those towers are just sitting there in the woods, rotting away, their story untold, forgotten. Nobody knows what they are. Very few people realize that those towers were part of Integrated Fire Control Site November '85, which handled defense of the Patrick Henry Demby area of Newport News. And it's a bit of a tragedy, you know? I got kind of obsessed with them and finding out more about them because there's a story here. Nobody seemed to know what they were, and I was very intent to find out. So I first found the towers in 2010. There are buildings out there that when I found them, they had roofs. And after the various hurricanes and everything else, those roofs have now collapsed, and they are the floor upon which you walk when you go and explore those ruins. I don't know how much longer that place will be here. So before any of that happens, I want to cover the story of it and capture it in the sense that it is now. So I hope that I can contribute in some small way to the preservation of these places and maybe give you something new to talk about with your buddies. I've got a lot of other topics planned. If you stick around with me here, I promise I'm going to bring you some interesting content. Now, I've taken enough of your precious time. I will let you get back to whatever mundane thing you were doing prior to this. Until next time, stay safe, and if you can't stay safe, baby, be dangerous. Midnight, going dark.